pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger, roll, Atlantic. Flight outside of speed off.
Yikes. You bet. Okay. We don't need any more of these.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to NASA Spaceflight Live, our weekly news show where we just talk about space stuff for an hour and a half because it's fun to do that with a bunch of space nerds. We've got two friends joining me today. My name is Thomas Burghardt, reporter for NASA Spaceflight. You've seen me on here before. You've also seen Mr. Chris Gebhardt, assistant managing editor of NASA Spaceflight. Chris, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. How about yourself, Thomas?
I'm doing great. We've also got a returning guest over on my other side here, Mr. John Kraus. John, how are you doing?
I've never been better. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, thanks for coming on. Freelance photographer out at Cape Canaveral, as always, and back here on NSF Live again. We've had him on before, and basically, we had a spot to fill today. We said, John, come back. So thanks for joining us here kind of at the last minute. We
Yeah.
appreciate it. So
I
we've
am
got
happy to be here.
always. We've got a bunch of cool stuff to talk about this week, not least of which is the big SpaceX Crew-2 mission, which just arrived to the space station. We'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about the first. People keeps calling it the first powered flight on Mars. It's not the first powered flight on Mars, but the Ingenuity helicopter flight on Mars. We'll talk about that, and then of course we're going to talk about some Starship stuff and a whole bunch of anything else that chat wants to talk about because this is a live and interactive show. So if you have any questions about what we're talking about, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Tag us with @NASASpaceflight, and we'll try and bring those questions into the queue and actually answer those along the way too. But to start, I think we're going to talk a little bit about the SpaceX Crew-2 mission. So yeah, I guess I'll do a brief overview really quick. This was the second operational crew rotation mission on Crew Dragon, carrying 4 astronauts, pilot Megan MacArthur, Commander Shane Kimbrough, European astronaut Thomas Pesquet, and Aki Hoshide from the Japanese Space Agency. And those 4 members making the 23.5-hour commute to orbit, lifting off early on Friday morning. And it was an absolutely gorgeous launch, and I'm going to lend it to some of the other people who also saw there, and of course our photographer on the show, talk a little bit about what we saw this, because I'll let the video roll, but it was a pretty standard nighttime liftoff until a couple minutes in the flight, and we got something really special, right?
It was it was jaw-droppingly gorgeous. I mean, John, I can't wait to hear what you thought from a photographer's perspective. But you know, the timing of the morning right. It was 1 hour and 1 minute prior to sunrise local time at the Cape was the liftoff. And of course, that gets all of us going like, ooh, it's within that window that maybe it'll do it. Maybe it'll do the thing. And we refer to it as the thing.
The thing.
The thing we are referring to is the jellyfish, where it's still dark on the ground, but as the second stage ascends, its plume really expands in the morning light because it's being hit by sunlight, and all the water particles and everything are refracting light and reflecting light. But what's also really, really cool is that because the first stage booster is also doing its thing and pulsing its cold gas thrusters, you can also see its separate plumes. And these just looked like Wi-Fi icons on your computer radiating outward from the vehicle. And I mean, it was gorgeous. It was absolutely stunningly gorgeous. And that's not even from the technical perspective.
Right, yeah, that's just from a
Yeah.
launch viewing perspective. John, what do you think? I mean,
Yeah, it was great. I think these crew flights fly a bit of a loftier trajectory, which I think helps with this jellyfish phenomenon. Because, like you said, it goes up into what we kind of call orbital sunrise. So the sun is rising downrange, and in the atmosphere, there's light, but we're still in the dark. So it's this great contrast that we wouldn't see during a normal nighttime flight or a daytime flight. And I think it's worth
Yeah.
pointing out is these things happen every launch. We just don't see them because of the lighting conditions. It's just cool to think how much really goes on during a launch, not all of which we see.
Yeah, it really is. And you know, I think that was a I think that was a good point, John, about the crew flights flying a lofted trajectory, because that higher trajectory does help throw them up higher. Because I know there are sometimes like that hour, like when you're sitting an hour before sunrise, like there's the legitimate question of will it do it, will it not? And I know a lot of us beforehand were like, we really hope it does, but we were also trying to manage expectations of like a minute, an hour beforehand. It's so dependent on the trajectory at that point.
Yeah,
And I think you're
it
right. I think the crew trajectory helps because it is higher.
it was better than I expected had it launched the day prior. I think once it moved a day, a
Yes.
lot of people were expecting it to be not as impressive. The
Mhm.
context being, had it launched a day prior, it would have been 20 minutes closer to sunrise. But I was pleasantly surprised, and I think it was better than I would have expected had it launched a day prior.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. We're
And I mean,
coming up on this. The video we're showing is just our broadcast video, and of course, what you're looking at now is the second stage engine firing, and it's about to enter the point. Right now, it is still not in sunlight. It's above, obviously, a fair bit above the surface of the Earth, but it has not reached the point where the second stage is illuminated by sunlight. However, you can now see that the first stage, as it kind of reaches its apogee and is not flying quite as horizontal at that as the second stage is starting to get lit up by the sun as it kind of enters that orbital sunrise. The second stage will hit that any second here, and you'll start to see the exhaust get backlit, and we'll show you how that looks from the ground, because on the
yeah,
ground
and there it
it's
is.
still darkness. And yeah, you can see both stages are lit up now. On the ground, obviously the sun has not risen yet, so it's just a nighttime. But we're seeing this thing in the sky that is being lit by the sun, because when you're higher up, the sun rises earlier, basically. And there you go. You can see that
There it
there.
is. And I
And
mean,
on
there's that first stage pulsing. I
yeah,
mean, it's incredible.
yeah. On the left side is that first stage, which is firing thrusters to reorient itself for the reentry burn, and on the right, the lower right, is just the normal exhaust from the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage.
It's
Uh,
I think it's just so
and I
cool
mean,
to like point it out and say there's four people in this video. Like
Yeah,
at the
yes.
dot on the right, like there are four human beings approaching 17,500 miles an hour to rendezvous with a space station with seven people waiting for them. That's just like so cool to break down that way.
And that the Falcon 9 did it again.
Yes,
Absolutely perfect
yes.
performance. Got them exactly where they wanted to go and where they needed to be, with no hiccups in the pre-flight or flight timelines. And yeah, I mean, that's really impressive. And not just that, it was the booster was being reflown again. It was a B-1061, which launched the Crew-1 mission as well back in November, and then we had Endeavour on top again. So yeah, and healthy performance across the board from these vehicles. It's exactly what we want to see, and it's exactly what the commercial crew program was born to do. Although, we had always envisioned that a Dragon would be handing over to a Starliner and a Starliner to a Dragon. We at least have SpaceX ready right now with Starliner coming up with its orbital reflight test and then crew test later this year as well, when the station schedule will prevail or will determine that. But what prevails here is the ability to get the next crew up there, and that is in large part the redundancy that was built into the commercial crew program from the very beginning with two providers.
really quick here.
And it's
Musical Wolves. It was not a Dogecoin on the way to the ISS. Okay, this was a rocket with human beings on board. No Dogecoin involved. All right, that was a super chat. Really quick. Appreciate it. Also, Eric
that's
with a new
funny.
I like
membership.
that. I
Thanks
like
for
that.
joining on. And then we actually have a very generous Evan White, $50 super chat. Thank you so much. Say, we live
Thank
in a
you very
small world
much.
with a big future. Keep up the great work, NSF team. Here's $50 for the Galloway Household Roof Camera Fund. Appreciate the support there, Evan. Thank you so much. Das will appreciate that. I know he's listening in on this. He's not with us right now, but I know he's listening. So there you go, Das. There's $50 for the roof camera fund. But yeah,
And
so yeah,
you mentioned Chris. Oh, sorry. I think we're like a second and a half behind, so I don't mean to keep speaking over
no,
you.
you're
Sorry.
good.
It
Um,
happens, yeah.
so so anyway, Chris mentioned that this was a reflight for both Falcon and Dragon, but it's worth adding this is the first time that we've ever seen humans launch on a reflown Dragon and a reflown Falcon. And
Mhm.
I mean, NASA and SpaceX didn't ignore that in their pre-launch materials, but it was like almost an afterthought, which I think is really cool that it we didn't need to make a huge deal out of it just because like that's what SpaceX does. They refly Falcons, and the majority of flights now are on boosters that have flown before. And it's kind of just they've normalized this over the last 4 years or so, which I think
Mhm.
is just absolutely remarkable and game changing.
And then worth
Yeah, and,
mentioning
and I
that the
mean,
last time humans flew on a reused spacecraft was, of course,
Oh, here we
STS-135.
go.
Listen, I had to beat Chris to it, all right?
Yeah.
well, yeah, I mean, it's a big deal for SpaceX. Absolutely that this is the fulfillment of one of the goals for what Dragon always was. It's important to note too that NASA, even though SpaceX from the outset wanted to make Crew Dragon reusable, NASA was against it, and against reusing Dragons for a very, very long time, until just before the Demo 2 mission, when all of a sudden they announced, like, yep, no, this is the one that will fly Crew-2. And then they got comfortable with the boosters as well. So, which is, just going to say it, a kind of shocking standpoint to be at for an organization whose prior 40 years was reliant on a reusable vehicle
Hmm.
with reusable boosters. But c'est la vie, that's what we got. But I mean, we're here, and it's easy to question that, and I think it's valid to question that, but we're here, and we have the fruits of the labor of the commercial crew program and everything that SpaceX and especially NASA through the leadership of Kathy Leaders. I mean, today was a real culmination of a lot of the work. I know Demo 2 was a big moment. Crew 1 was a huge moment with the first operational flight, but getting the second operational flight up while the first one's still there and demonstrating that ability to have that continuous access. I mean, that was the culmination of the large part of the program and its goals here. And it was really good to see, especially this morning when they docked successfully.
Yeah, and we'll get to docking in a
Yeah.
second here. I do want to add on to that talk about the reusability, because when we were doing a couple interviews with some NASA managers who have worked with SpaceX and NASA on getting Crew Dragon, especially certifying the reuse aspect of it, a big part of it was when both Boeing and SpaceX came to NASA with their proposals for commercial crew. SpaceX did not propose using reused spacecraft right away. Their proposal was new spacecraft to start, and once we get the first one back after Demo 1, we'll inspect it, we'll see what it looks like, and determine the path forward to reusability from there, which is actually different than the Boeing proposal, which relied on reflying capsules straight away. Obviously, not that they wouldn't also do inspections post-flight to figure out how much work they really do need to do between flights, but they were assuming that reuse would be practical from after the very first flight. And even the Starliner that flew the first orbital flight test will fly again on the crew flight test. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but after Demo 1 came back, after Demo 2 came back, the data from all of those missions have fully supported the idea of flying them again. We actually have a question here asking which Dragon will fly Crew 3. I believe Crew 3 will get a new Dragon because they do want to kind of grow their fleet of spacecraft a little bit. So not all of them are going to be on reflown Dragons right away. Crew 3 will be on a new one, and I believe... well, I think it depends. So when Crew 2 comes back on Endeavour, that will be the first one to to come back after a second mission. And NASA and SpaceX are kind of taking that incremental approach to, all right, this is the first one that did second flights. Let's do inspections here, see what it looks like, and figure out is third flights, within the safety margins. And so they'll kind of sequentially, after everyone reaches a new milestone, figure out, can we fly it again, or is this the point where we need to retire the spacecraft? The kind of stretch goal that they've been looking at is for as many as 5 flights for a Dragon or a Falcon 9, but it could be more, it could be less, depending on how they look when they get back. But for now, Crew 3 gets a new one. Dragon Resilience is reserved for the Inspiration4 mission, which will actually be the next human spaceflight from the United States. Next orbital human spaceflight. I guess Blue
Orbital.
Origin could do a thing.
Yeah.
Yes, next orbital human spaceflight from the United States will be the Inspiration4 all-civilian mission, not to the ISS, just to low Earth orbit on a free-flying Dragon Resilience. So that's why Resilience is not flying Crew 3, at least.
Yeah. And yeah, and actually, I have a question for you, John, because you got to watch it from a fairly unique perspective
Hmm.
on this one. What was it like watching Crew 2 launch with the 4 people who are on the next scheduled flight of
Yeah,
Dragon?
it was surreal, and I'll fill in a little context. So the last time I was on NSF Live, I was talking about my bid to fly on Inspiration 4, and you can tell by me not being in this picture that I didn't win that bid, which is fine because they actually noticed my photography work, and Jared Isaacman and the campaign brought me on to be their official photographer. So I travel with the crew for their training and really whatever they do together. and photograph them as they prepare to go to space later this year. And they were all here at Kennedy Space Center for the launch of Crew-2, which, as we said, was the last human orbital spaceflight from the United States before these people launch. Um, it was just so cool to watch them, and we had some cool conversations afterward about what they felt. Most launch viewers aren't watching a launch going, the next time this happens, I'm going to be on top of it. So that was a very unique perspective for them. For Haley, it was her first launch ever. She had never seen a launch before. For Chris and Dr. Cyan Proctor, it was their first time seeing a SpaceX launch. And for Jared, it was his second SpaceX launch after Crew-1. So just to capture this photograph of them watching and soaking it in was really cool. And it was a unique experience for me because from a photographic perspective, because I didn't actually like see the first 30 to 45 seconds of the launch. So my indication that it lifted off was like their faces lighting up. And that they're all like, you can see Cyan's eyes in this photo are kind of wide. She's like taking it in. So it was a very unique perspective to get to share that experience with these four people.
I think a thing that's kind of difficult to talk about when you're talking about these crew launches is because if you're looking at the launch, from the pure visual perspective, it doesn't look different than any other rocket launch. You don't see the people with
Mhm.
your own eyes while you're watching, so it looks like a rocket launch. And even though this particular launch was so visually stunning, if the payload was a batch of Starlink satellites, the rocket would have done the same thing more or less, and the launch would have been just as beautiful. But you have to kind of remind yourself during the launch that not only does it look as cool and feel as cool as a rocket launch does, but you have to remind yourself what the payload is, and that just makes it that much more special because you don't really get that from pure visuals.
Mm-hmm.
It's very like profound and visceral to just watch that, and we talked about that afterward a bit, myself and the crew. Just like there's this blazing ball of fire ripping toward orbit, but like there's just four little people at the top of it, and it's just like just everything you alluded to. You just have to remind yourself that there really are human lives on top of that vehicle.
I'm gonna keep bringing up. We've got a bunch of cool like photos and stuff, and I know I've got some from John here too. John, I believe this is your streak shot that you got
Yeah,
from.
so you can't see it in the photo of the four crew, but like just a couple feet in front of them, I had this camera set up doing a streak shot through the trees at Kennedy Space Center. You can see we kind of got clouded out on most of the spectacular parts, but I also ended the exposure a little bit too early because I thought we were going to get clouded out. I'm like, why keep running it? But we did end up getting a little break in the clouds a bit after this photo ended to see a lot of the RCS thrusters in the second stage and whatnot. So it all worked out.
That's
Good,
cool.
at
We've
least.
also got, and we showed a little bit of this on the. Oh wait, no, I hit the wrong thing. We had some more photos. I like this one here from Stephen Marr for NSF. He was down. I forget where exactly this is, but this is the like a big Apollo memorial, and he got the.
Mhm.
He told me that he just
I just
eyeballed
know.
this, and it was like perfect. So that's another really cool photo.
Really cool photo.
There was a ton of cool photos from this launch from all sorts of photographers everywhere. I'm just trying to highlight a couple of these. While I do that, I'm going to bring up some questions for you guys to talk about, and I'll keep showing stuff. We did have a question about something that actually happened shortly after launch. The core, which stands for Crew Operations Something Engineer, I think it's basically the resource engineer. Thank you, Michael. Crew Operations Resource Engineer, one of the big flight controllers down in Hawthorne, California, from SpaceX, actually instructing the crew to put their spacesuits back on a few minutes after launch because of a possible flyby with another object in orbit. Do we have any updates as to what that was about? There was some unknown object that was going to pass close to Dragon Endeavor, and they had only like 20 minutes notice or so. So they actually had the crew put their spacesuits on to protect against the risk of a depressurization event. They didn't conduct they didn't conduct an avoidance maneuver, and it passed without incident because they reevaluated and found that they had more distance than they thought. But do we have any idea what that other object was or why they had so little notice on it?
I've not heard or seen anything about what the object was. No, but well, this kind of highlights the difficulties in tracking objects in orbit. This was not something that was seen prior. It was not something that was being tracked. It was something that after Dragon had lifted off, they became concerned with during its first orbit. It's not unusual for launch teams, especially Space Command, who is monitoring all of this and monitoring the on-orbit debris environment. It's not unusual to have what are called cutouts or COLAs, collision avoidance areas in your countdown, where you say, well, you can't launch within this given number of seconds because it will take you so close to one of these vehicles. There was an Electron launch last year that actually had a collision avoidance maneuver for the International Space Station, for the orbit that it was going into. So those things aren't uncommon. And things are definitely tracked, but this was one of them from the initial indications that wasn't seen before. Was first found after Dragon lifted off. They realized it was going to come close, and this gave them the opportunity to test something they really hadn't wanted to test, but gives them some good answers, because this is exactly what they're supposed to do in this situation like that. If there was a risk of a collision and a possible depressurization, you put your pressure suits on. They never tested this in like it's an actual event. All four of you need to get into your suits immediately. And they got the ability to do that in a very short timeline. And there was actually someone who commented on this from NASA, saying that the roominess of the capsules nowadays really permitted that, and that had it been smaller, would have taken them longer. So in that regard, it was serving its purpose. As to why they didn't do a collision avoidance maneuver once they realized they were coming within range of it, because they found it so late and they didn't have a really firm grasp on how close the actual conjunction was going to be between the two of them. When you don't have those figures, you don't move your spacecraft. You just let them keep going in their passive orbits, because you can make it 1,000 times worse by trying to
Right.
get out of the way of something whose orbit and precise characteristics you don't yet understand.
I believe the saying from Chris Hadfield is there's no problem in space that you can't make worse. So
Yes.
yeah,
Very
Haven't heard that
quickly.
one.
Yes.
That's good. Wow.
it's very true.
Yeah.
So yeah, especially because I mean you're flying along this pre-planned trajectory, and the effects from a collision avoidance maneuver could be moving farther from the object, or could be moving closer, because again you're working with a lot of there are big error bars. Even if you see it days in advance, you see, oh, these two objects are going to actually pass pretty close to one another. All that tracking data has pretty large error bars, especially because things like orbital decay drag and things like that can actually change the trajectories. So it is not super reliable, unless you want to conduct a huge burn to get many kilometers away. So it's best to kind of leave it be, not least because you also would then completely mess up your rendezvous trajectory. If they had to conduct a drastic maneuver, it's very possible that they would not have been able to reach the station, or at least not on their normal timeline, and would have had to conduct some other maneuvers to kind of reset themselves up to rendezvous with the station. So with all of those consequences, and the possibility of even making it worse, it doesn't actually make sense to do an avoidance maneuver in that particular scenario.
I
But
think
it will
there's
be
one
interesting
thing
to see what it was. Yeah.
worth pointing out is, and maybe for this, like, we don't always know exactly where something in space is. We just have data that may be old about where it is, how fast it's traveling. You can know a car is on the highway going 60 miles an hour, but you can also visually see it or have like perfect GPS on it. But we may just know that a satellite was recently going here at this speed, and then we have to like extrapolate data about where it may be, which adds a
Well,
lot of uncertainty to these kind of things.
oh, 100%. And especially when you run into the situation like we did with this particular thing where we don't know what it is. So
Yeah.
you're relying on the radar hits, bouncing back to the ground stations. And you're trying to go like, well, it looks like it's the size of my thumb, but what if it's the width of my thumb and it's this gigantic thing that extends backward 12 meters, but it's aimed just perfectly that your
Right.
radar does? I mean, and that's the uncertainty you're trying to avoid. We had a couple last year. We had a couple of two defunct satellites that came pretty close to one another up there, and it was a misdistance probability. I think the final one was about 20 meters and I think it ended up missing by 40 or something like that. But the problem was at one point they were going to miss by 12 meters, which sounds great, except one of them has a 17-meter long arm.
Right.
And suddenly you're like, oh, well, it could
That
hit
would
the
mean
arm.
that they'll hit. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, not knowing what it is in some ways, trying to get away from something you really don't know what it is even worse. Because
And
yeah.
I have a question for you guys because I didn't follow this too closely yesterday because I pretty much went right to sleep. Was this a case of
Same.
officials knew what it was but didn't share it, or did they not know what it was?
I've heard nothing regarding anyone knowing what it was. It was
Okay,
just classed as an unknown object or a
got it.
debris object. It might also be, like Chris mentioned, since we didn't have very precise ideas of how close the conjunction might be. If I had to guess, it's got to be a debris event like a speck of paint or something, or a bolt or something that has come from whatever previous mission, and thus we can't connect it to any specific launch or event or anything. It's just something that radar is seeing in orbit. Um, yeah,
Which shows
is
how
what I would
devastating
guess.
something as small as a bolt hitting a spacecraft at
Right.
orbital velocities can be. I mean,
Yeah, and at
even specks of paint.
yeah, and it can be twice orbital velocity if they're going the opposite directions.
Yep.
So yeah, the small objects with that much velocity can be that's a lot of kinetic energy. So,
Oh yeah.
but
Oh yeah. I
regardless,
mean,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead, Chris. I don't want to keep
yeah,
you
no,
going.
I was just gonna say, like one of the things with the space station solar arrays that we knew was going to happen over time was they were going to get hit by these
Hmm.
small pieces of, it's called, the technical term for it is micrometeoroid orbiting debris if it's natural. But we knew they were going to get hit by this stuff and stuff that would float away from other spacecrafts and other and station itself. And the solar arrays have tiny little holes in them from being hit as well. They've also held up remarkably well and remarkably better than we had initially thought. So like there is some room to be somewhat positive that it's not like such an imminent threat that, oh my gosh, we have to look out for this all the time. We do monitor it to make sure vehicles aren't under threat, but it's not an environment that that the astronauts constantly have to worry about each day. That's for the ground teams monitoring it all.
Right. So that was shortly after liftoff passed without incident. It was actually like 30 minutes before the crew was supposed to go to sleep. So I hope they still slept well after that close call. Although astronauts tend to keep their cool about those kind of things, so I'm sure it was fine. Um, actually, John. So John, you've kind of hung out with the Inspiration4 crew a little bit, obviously. What is your impression with them? And I don't know. I think you've also had the opportunity to at least hear from some astronauts via media events and things. So do they feel a lot different from like your standard like career astronauts that are doing this professionally versus someone who like a civilian doing this as sort of a one-time tourist thing?
Yeah, I've seen some chatter about this, and I think it's worth noting that these aren't simply people that are being told they're flying on Dragon in 2 weeks and they're going to get in and strap in and they're going to sit in a chair bolted to it for 3 days. Like, they're getting astronaut training.
Hmm.
They're not going to be career astronauts trained by NASA over the course of years with the selection process, and then maybe you do all this training and you don't fly. But they are, like, they've done centrifuge training, and they have other events sanctioned by SpaceX and others coming up. So they're being trained, and they understand the gravity and seriousness of the situation, and they're actually. As for their mindset, they're excited. They're kind of going to be trailblazers in a way with this being the first all civilian mission. But I just wanted to point that out because there are some people that are throwing out that like they're just spaceflight participants, but they are like being trained as astronauts. It's just not under a government entity like we've seen before.
Right, absolutely. And again, what I'm showing now is obviously the docking. This happened early this morning, about 23 and a half hours after launch, so not a too long coast to rendezvous with the station. Docking going perfectly. So the crew members now on board the ISS. There are actually 11 people on the ISS, and I'll bring up this picture because the station's getting pretty crowded. Not as crowded as it's ever gotten. It's gotten even more crowded in the past, but we've got 11 crew members on board now. You've got the crew of SpaceX Crew-1. Let's see. On the very left, we've got oh my gosh,
It's Mike. Yeah, so
Hopkins.
it is.
Mike.
It's Mike Hopkins.
Go.
Yeah, so it's Mike Hopkins and Soichi Noguchi.
Yeah.
And then just above Soichi is
Mark
Mark
Van
Van
de
High.
Yeah.
Yes. And then we have the Soyuz MS-18 commander's name, who I'm totally blanking on right now.
Is it an Oleg? I feel like his name's Oleg. Hold on. I've got the internet. Give me a second.
Artemiev?
Anyway, after him is Peter Dubrov, also from Soyuz MS-18, and then Shannon Walker and Victor Glover. Those are all the blue shirt people, and then from right to left on those in the black shirts is Toma, Aki, Shane, and Megan.
Yes, and it was Oleg Novitsky is the commander of Soyuz MS-18.
Yes.
So I was right. But yeah, so basically, 2 SpaceX Crew Dragon crews and a Soyuz crew all on board the station. Of course, Soyuz MS-17 just left a little bit ago after MS-18 arrived, and they were kind of temporarily up to 10 crew members because Soyuz carries 3 at a time, and of course, Crew Dragon carrying 4. They're up to 11. The record has still not been beat. 13 crew members on board back in, I want to say it was like 2011. No, it wasn't.
July of 2009 was the first time it happened.
Why was I speculating? I could have just asked Chris. We all know. 13 crew members.
I bet he knew because Shuttle was involved.
Yeah, exactly.
It was indeed. It was STS-127, the flight of Endeavour, that delivered the external elements of the Japanese experiment module to the station.
I love
the
it.
station's crew had actually just increased. The station's crew had actually just increased to 9 or to 6 at that point. Just a few months prior to Endeavour's launch.
Wasn't it either Soichi or Aki who were on that mission for the Japanese element of it? It was one of them, right?
Aki was on a previous Japanese flight that delivered the laboratory complex up to the station.
Okay.
And Soichi arrived, I believe Soichi arrived shortly thereafter in October, November of 2009, because he was there in early 2010 as well.
Gotcha. So that was a 7-person shuttle crew and then 2 3-person Soyuz crew, so 13 on station. Is it possible that we'll have a time where there are like 2 commercial crew vehicles and 3 Soyuz docked to the station at once? Is that something that could happen with station scheduling, or will they avoid that?
Say that again?
So right now, the only way we could beat that record is if we added another Soyuz to what we currently have. So 2 commercial crew vehicles, because that's 4 each, and then there has been times where there have been three Soyuz can dock to the station at once. They have enough ports for that. But was there any reason they would ever do that?
I believe the station's life support systems can surge to 16 for a brief period of time.
Right. If we're talking about like a handover period of a couple days, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't believe there's anything that precludes it from a life support standpoint. Although that would just get really busy for the crews, and I could see them not wanting to do that from a crew work perspective.
Sure.
It is kind of beneficial for half of your crew to be handing over to the new guys while the other half is still doing everything they normally do, than everyone having to hand over to everyone else at the same time.
And here's another shot just kind of showing you how busy the station is. And I'm going to break out my telestration tools. Thanks, Das. We've got Dragon Resilience, which is the Crew 1 vehicle. We've got a Northrop Grumman Cygnus spacecraft docked right here. Of course, this is the docking port where Crew 1 or Crew 2 Endeavour docked to. And then you can see at least 1 Soyuz down there. And I believe on the other side would be another Soyuz and at least 1, maybe even 2 Progress vehicles.
So yeah, the Soyuz at the bottom, the one you can see the service module for, is Soyuz MS-18 that just arrived.
I don't think you can...
No. That's a Progress that just arrived. That's a Progress that's going to take the that's the Progress that's going to take the Piers docking compartment away from the space station to make room for Nauka. And then the Soyuz MS-18 is on the top of the space station at the or is behind it at the Rossovat module.
Right, and then I think there's actually aren't there two Progress docked too? There's another one, yes.
There's another one docked to the aft end of the Zvezda service module, which has been there for over a year at this point, with no immediate plans to leave as they continue to look at the cracks that they have observed in the Zvezda service module. Yes.
Yeah, and so this is kind of looking at the what we call the U.S. side of the space station. So the Russian vehicles docked to the other half of the station. But I love this view of the Dragon up top. I know, unfortunately, I don't think there's any spacewalks planned over the next couple of days or anything like that. I don't know if we'll get a good opportunity to get a great view of both Dragons docked with like a really good quality camera. I know there was a photo taken by Soichi Noguchi from Dragon Resilience, and that's looking at Endeavour docked to it. So that's kind of a cool shot. I don't think we'll get a chance to see like an external view of the two spacecraft docked to one another, but nevertheless, that is pretty cool. Maybe one day we'll get a
Yells at
spacewalk while
NASA's
there's two.
external cameras.
Yeah. That would be really cool. We got a bunch of questions to keep going through, so I'll keep bringing them up. Just a super chat here from Walkwell saying, "Congratulations, team, on the coverage of Crew-2. Thank you so much for the support there." Future Martian with the $20 super chat. Thank you so much. He's one of our writers for NSF, so thanks for sending a super chat there, Anthony. We appreciate it. And then let's see, a question here, or a super chat saying, "Here's a portion of my Dogecoin proceeds." All right, listen.
Oh.
Slowly recovering from lack of sleep after Crew-2. Keep up the awesome work, guys. Us too, but we're getting there. Appreciate the support there. And then Razor with a new membership as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for the appreciate all the support. A question here from Dan asking, does SpaceX have controllers on console for the entire time Dragon is docked to the station? Or can they sign off once docking is complete? Chris, do you know?
Your audio hiccuped. Which controllers?
Just SpaceX controllers. So we're talking about Hawthorne specifically.
I believe the way it works is a vast majority of the team does step away and sign off because Dragon basically goes. I mean, they don't completely power it down, but you can think of it as like there's active mode where it has to do everything, and then it's just like I'm at the station and I'm along for the ride, but my power systems still need to be on to provide life support. Right? It's kind of like turning your car to idle. So there are still people monitoring it. Everyone is, its systems are still being monitored. Its health is still being monitored. SpaceX controllers are there in case anything should happen. Like, I believe it was last month or earlier this month when there was some type of like a power switch on board the station, and station systems momentarily freaked out thinking something was wrong with Dragon when nothing was actually wrong. And it was just, one of those hiccups that you only find when spacecraft talk to each other for long periods of time. But SpaceX controllers were right there to confirm, the health of their spacecraft and be ready in case that fire indication was actually real, but maybe on the station, and Dragon needed to be used as an abort vehicle. So in that regard, they're always being monitored, but it's not as intense as it is once in the free flying portions of the flight program and the flight pattern.
Got a good question here from Brian saying, now that there are 11 crewmates on board the station, where the heck will everyone sleep?
Yes, the who has a room question. Yes.
I know there was one sleep period on the way to the station, so those 4 crew members could just sleep in Dragon, right? And I imagine that's what they do until the handover is complete.
So yes and no, actually. There's kind of two different ways to answer this question. So they have installed temporary sleeping compartments within modules on the U.S. side of the space station to accommodate the surge to 8 people on the U.S. side of the space station, and basically, Mike Hopkins will continue to sleep in Crew Dragon Resilience as he has for the entire 6-month duration up there. Someone's going to have to sleep inside Dragon Endeavor again because they don't have another permanent compartment to add just yet. But they do have these temporary ones that they can put up during the surge. So that's where everyone will sort of sleep right now, as some of the U.S. crew members who have been there and the more permanent ones are handing over those quarters to their counterparts who have now arrived.
Do we know, are the lack of sleeping compartments like a volume constraint? Is it a conscious decision? Why is that the case? Because it kind of seems like, well, why not just add more?
Yeah, so there is a plan to add another one, and it's sort of had always been planned because the normal crew complement of the station was always set to be 7. But then because Soyuz can only take 3 at a time and everyone needs a lifeboat, we were really constrained there after the shuttle program ended for how many we could have up there. So now that so in the long interim, they basically took that space and made it experiment space. So there are different things that need to be moved around now and prepared to get that 7th permanent sleeping compartment up there on the US side of the station.
I don't know about y'all, but Commander Hopkins getting to sleep in Brazilian sounds like a good gig. I want a Dragon capsule all to myself every night.
I know, right?
That sounds
My
like might
gosh.
be the coolest sleeping
Yeah.
arrangement on station. Oh, we don't have a room for you, so you just gotta sleep in Dragon every night.
I know, right? With 7 windows to look at the Earth
And
whenever you can't sleep. Yeah, like I think I'd take that. Now, of course, I'll add that there is a caveat to that. I think we'd be remiss in the long run if we didn't also mention, crew sleeping areas might be a little easier on the US side of the space station, especially if Russia's comment, I'll call it, to completely pull out of the International Space Station program and just give, in quotes, give the Russian side to NASA, and basically the International Space Station just becomes everyone but Russia.
And China.
Well, of the people who are
Right, yeah, I
currently
got you.
participating in it. It remains everyone but Russia, as Russia does go off to talk about their next space station in cooperation with China in that regard. But we'll see. I personally think I'm personally going to remain skeptical until I see more.
Yeah.
We've
It's
heard
really
this
early too,
before.
because we're talking
Yeah.
about like that's a few years from now, and I think the plans will keep changing over and over again. But
And Nauka is just about to launch in a couple
right,
of
yeah.
months. Like, I'll believe it when I see it. I mean, we might have to figure out what to do with Zarya, or not Zarya, Zvezda, the Zvezda service module, where that crack is. But I mean, nothing is insurmountable. But we'll see how it goes after 2025.
Can they, and do we think they might separate their segments and say, no, you can't have them and deorbit them? Or is that a risky thing structurally for the whole station, or what?
Well, the only the only 2 modules they could technically take away are, if they wanted to. I don't think they would. Let me answer that. If they really wanted to, Russia owns the Zvezda service module, the Rasavat module, and Piers and the soon-to-be launched Nauka, as well as Poisk. They do not own Zarya. Zarya is actually a co-own between NASA and Roscosmos, so they can't take that one. But the larger point is that the Russian station is pretty critical to the overall survival and functionality of the International Space Station and its control systems and life support systems. So they were never designed to be de-integrated from the complex. So hence Russia's statement of transferring the Russian segment to NASA instead of just saying ours.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And we're also launching Axiom modules within the next few years to kind of add on to the US side. So the space station is going to change a lot, and it might end up being at some point it expands a little bit, and then they say, okay, we're going to ditch all these old modules and deorbit that, and the new modules that we've launched in the last couple of years will become some new station, which was like part of the ISS at one point, but now operating on its own. So there's that element to consider too.
Now, and knowing that Russia has at least stated an interest in potentially doing this, well, 4 to 5 years out, that's enough time to go to Axiom and say, what can you include in your new modules that we might lose soon
From the Russian side, right.
or need to complement from the Russian side? There are ways to work this that don't mean the impending end of the International Space Station,
Right.
or anything to the kind. Yeah.
And even if the International Space Station ends in a few years, we've got enough plans through Axiom, and there are also other concepts for other new commercial low Earth orbit stations where NASA is already planning to be heavily involved in those programs, even if they're operated by a commercial arm, just like Crew Dragon is. NASA would simply say, all right, we want to book a room at the Axiom Hotel for 6 months, or however you want to think of it, and we'll buy experiment space, we'll buy space to house our astronauts, and they'll do the same stuff they've been doing on the ISS, just in these new fancy modern modules. And that's going to continue going forward, and that's going to continue to be an international effort. NASA is going to keep working with Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, JAXA, and of course, if they can continue operating with Roscosmos, that'd be great. In a perfect world, we'd actually onboard China, but who knows if that's going to happen. Regardless, it will
India
be
as
a
well.
cooperative effort. Right? India, yeah, because they want to bring
The
human
United Arab
spaceflight up.
Emirates is involved with
That's
us
true, and
going
that's happened
forward.
before because UAE has sent people to the station before, right?
Yes, Hazza Al Mansouri.
Right,
couple
yeah.
of years ago.
So that's also even already underway to a degree. So yeah, hopefully, even if the station that they're visiting changes, that element continues and progresses strongly.
Yeah, and the last thing I'd add to that is, please, please, please let the near 10-year or let the 9-year gap between Shuttle and Dragon be the lesson we beat people over the head with when it comes to space stations. Do not get rid of the International Space Station before its successor or successors are up there.
Exactly. And that's actually another thing, and spoiler alert, the Starship segment's coming later, but another point that I'll bring up because it's relevant, when people talk about when will it be time to retire SLS and Orion in favor of a lower cost and different variant, aka Starship, or other vehicles that come along with similar capabilities, that will be another lesson to say is like, all right, once you establish that you're regularly sending people to lunar orbit and to the lunar surface, don't stop doing it with Orion and SLS until the new one is fully operational and ready to pick up the torch. Don't say, all right, we're going to retire it and bring up Starship in 2 years, because then those 2 years will become 8 years, because that's how space programs work. And you'll have that huge gap there. So that's another lesson that I agree with you, I hope that we remember and learn from. We've got a couple quick questions to wrap up the Crew-2 discussion because we've got other stuff to talk about too. Falcon Heavy side booster wants to know how long will the Inspiration4 mission last? Maybe Resilience will be the first to fly twice. I'm gonna
I
assume
have
the
a joke
question should
answer.
say 3 times. Oh yeah.
I have a joke answer. Since it's a Falcon Heavy side booster that wants to know, my answer is longer than your flight.
Making fun
funny.
of suborbital boosters. Yikes.
Oh, let's do that. Ooh.
No, let's not do that.
Yeah, so anyway,
No. We have a suborbital hop on
Inspiration-
Mars to talk about in a minute, so hold on a second.
Inspiration4 is going to be about 3 days, and it will be the second flight of Resilience.
Yeah, but it will be the second Dragon to fly 2 times because Endeavour,
That's
which
right.
just flew Crew-2, also flew Demo 2. So I wonder, the question could be, will Resilience be the first to fly 3 times? Because Resilience will launch after Crew-2 did, but also come back before Crew-2 comes back because it's not a long duration mission. So Resilience will be the next Dragon to come back from Earth after Crew-1, but Crew-1, Dragon only flew once, so is Resilience, so obviously. So Resilience will be the first one to come back after a second flight. And there's been talk of, since they're going to install that sort of that cupola, mini cupola dome over the docking port because it's not going to dock to anything. There's been a rumor that what if, or just an idea, what if they just keep Resilience configured that way? Because there are also other private Crew Dragon missions on the manifest for in the next several years. There's the Axiom mission, but that needs to dock to the Axiom station, I think, unless no, that's a lie. It docks to the International Space Station because Axiom won't be launched yet. But there's a Space Adventures mission on the manifest somewhere. We haven't heard from it in a little bit, but in theory, there are other free-flying Dragon missions coming up. So Resilience might be just earmarked for those going forward and stay with that sort of cupola edition instead of converting it back to a docking port and going back to station on its 3rd flight if they end up flying it a 3rd time. But I think there's potential for Resilience to be the first to fly a 3rd mission if they do one of those things. What do you guys think?
I think there's a chance of that, but I think where I'm getting hung up on providing a firm answer on that is I want to see how long it takes them to turn a capsule around. Because bringing Resilience back and launching it again in October is about 6 months, ish, give or take.
It's going to be sooner. September.
Yeah,
so even quicker.
Inspiration4 is launching in September.
Sure, let's go with this. Everything in spaceflight is no earlier than, and I'll believe September when we get to September, for a variety of reasons. Not the least of which is it's just not uncommon to slip several weeks or a month at this point in your flight. But I want to see how long it takes them to turn it around, right? Because a turnaround of 5 to 6 months, how quickly could you get that down becomes my question, right? Like, we know Crew-3 is going to be a new build because there's absolutely no way you could reinstall a docking port and refurbish a capsule and do everything in the couple of
weeks.
weeks that in the couple of weeks
Yeah.
that would be between the two of them. But if Axiom isn't in December, if Axiom is more realistically, say, January or February of next year, now I can see there's a possibility of getting the docking port back in there, getting the vehicle turned back around for docking mode. And then that would potentially free up Endeavour, which will come back in the October timeframe, to be ready for a notional Crew-4, just in case Starliner's not ready, or free up Endeavour to do something else after it. I could see that being a good cadence once they've got 3 to begin with. Yeah.
Sure. And then let's see. I'm trying to make sure we wrap up all the Crew-2 questions. Is this the first time 2 crews launched on the same vehicle have been in orbit at the same time? Oh, so referring to the Falcon 9 first stage, which launched both Crew-1 and Crew-2, which are both currently on orbit. Is that the first time something like that is? I mean, obviously a shuttle can't be in
point of
orbit
the
twice
question,
at once.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The answer to your question is yes. It is the first time that 2 crews are in space at the same time when the same first stage was used to launch them both. Yes.
And then, in the event of an emergency, how many crew could Dragon bring back to Earth? Same 4 that it brought up, and that's why they stayed docked to the station. That whatever vehicle you came up the station on is also your lifeboat should you need to evacuate. So
now, if there was a situation on the station which precluded the 3 Russian crew members from getting to the Soyuz, let's say, Dragon could, in an emergency, it's absolutely not ideal because there are not seats, but it could bring 4 of them back if that became the only option for some reason. And Starliner is the same, but under normal emergency evac operations of the space station, the vehicle you launched in is the one you go back to.
And then one last question here. When will we see... Actually, this is from Gary Blair. Is this the Gary Blair that flies over McGregor and sends us photos and stuff? If it is, what's up, Gary? Saying, when will we see a spacecraft commander who is not an aircraft pilot unless that's happened already?
It has not happened in the U.S. Space program. I cannot speak with a massive degree of confidence to the Russian space program or the Soviet space program. But no, because they were all Air Force test. I mean, they were Air Force test pilots primarily. They came from flying backgrounds. Throughout Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and Shuttle. And in fact, you had to be a pilot for Shuttle. There was no if, and, or but about that for Commander. So I don't believe it's happened on the U.S. side. No. And it would notionally be whichever crew mission, whichever crew flight is next, be it Crew-4 or the first Starliner flight, whatever that spring 2022 flight is, based on the ones we know, that would be the first one to hold the potential. Because Crew-3 has a pilot as the commander, and Michael
Jared Isaacman of Inspiration4 is a pilot.
Jared,
well, he's not
the Axiom mission. Michael Lopez Alegría, I don't know if he's a pilot or not.
There you go. That could be a candidate. But he was previously an astronaut, so he has some training. So it depends on, I guess, what makes you a pilot or not.
He is a test pilot. He is a test pilot and a veteran of 3 space shuttle missions.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
So don't know when we'll see that, or if we'll see that. It might be, I don't know, colonization flights to Mars with a bunch of civilians with no astronauts on board. I don't know. Maybe that'll be a thing. But appreciate the question in the super chat there, Gary. We would like to move on because we have spent 55 minutes talking about Crew-2, and there are other things that also happened this week. I want to talk a little bit about When Hop Mars Edition. All right,
yes.
This was the very first flight of Ingenuity, which is NASA's robotic helicopter that was tagged along and brought with the Perseverance rover. And I believe, I'm going to get my dates wrong. This first flight happened on the 19th, which was Monday. So this was early Monday morning. We received this video. This video is filmed by Perseverance looking at Ingenuity. And this is a short 39-second straight up and straight down flight. but this is the first time that sort of a controlled flight of an aircraft occurred off of Earth. Mars has a lot of unique challenges to this regard. The atmosphere is much thinner. I'm going to make sure this video is looping because it's only like 50 seconds. But Mars's atmosphere is really thin, so the blades need to spin very, very fast, offset a little bit by the lower gravity, but it is a challenge to fly on Mars. So, and there's a
It's
NASA
like
logo graphic.
yeah, it's like the equivalent of trying to fly a rotocraft at 100,000 feet on
Right.
Earth. And a rotocraft on Earth has not gone above 50,000 feet, and NASA not only managed to do the equivalent of doubling the Earth record, but did
Yeah.
it on another planet completely autonomously. So NASA was basically like, "We see your 50,000. We'll go to Mars."
And it was very cool because, yeah, like you mentioned, this all also has to happen autonomously. There isn't someone at JPL with a remote controller flying this thing. You have to send the flight program in advance, and then the helicopter did its flight, and then a couple hours later sent the data through Perseverance, through the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, to the Deep Space Network, to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and through all of that, several hours after the flight actually happened, is when we got confirmation that the flight had occurred in the first place, and then also occurred successfully. This is another view that they've enhanced a bit.
Yes. Yeah.
Ooh.
And you can see the dust that gets kicked up. It wasn't super visible in the first video, but this is enhanced a little bit to see it did kick up a little bit of dust. And they actually said in the sort of post-flight conference that they were surprised at how little dust was a problem. Where they were expecting kind of as they came back down for dust to be kind of a big issue and obscure the ground as they came and touched down, which is why they kind of, instead of like slowing down right before touchdown, they kind of just like let the spacecraft hit, which
Yeah.
makes sense because it's got those big shock absorbent legs. It's meant to do it that way. But you
But
see
it
there's
is
actually
kind of
not that much
jarring.
dust.
Like,
Yeah. They keep putting these giant NASA logos at the end of the video. I just want to see this hop over and over again, NASA. But
yeah.
yeah, and they actually said that after the flight, the helicopter was in healthier shape than before because it flying dusted off some of the dust on its solar panel up top. So it was actually charging faster after the flight than before. So it was a picture-perfect flight, and it actually set the stage for a second flight, which occurred yesterday. And I'll bring that video up.
I think it's crazy how quickly they turned it around. Like
Yeah,
usually you'd feel like something like this would take, 2 or 3 weeks, we want to really review the data, but like they just went for it,
You
which is
would,
awesome.
but I believe the primary science window that they've designed for this is only 30 days for
yes.
Ingenuity. They hope
Really.
to get more, but 30 days. So yeah, they've got to they've got to do it in quick succession here.
Is there a particular hardware limit or reason for that, or do they just want to do it early in the mission, or why is that?
I can speak to that a little bit. All of these flights rely on communications that are going through the Perseverance rover. Ingenuity does not have the ability to beam its telemetry straight to the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter or something like that. So while they are conducting these flight tests, they're calling it the month of Ingenuity because it's this 30-day period where they have an ability to conduct up to about 5 flights of Ingenuity is what they're looking at initially. And they've done 2 so far. They've got that limit because Perseverance kind of just has to sit there and act as a data relay. They parked it near some places where they're doing some ground sampling already and some drilling and things like that. But once it's done those jobs, it will, in order to continue to support Ingenuity operations, Perseverance has to sit there and act as a data relay, which is taking away from the actual primary mission. Ingenuity is a secondary objective. It's a tech demo. It's arguably already completed its main goals after the first couple of flights. The second flight featured a very slight diversion maneuver and then back to landing. The third flight coming up, which I don't believe they've set a date for yet, but it should be within the next couple days, will feature a much longer diversion. So they're still pursuing those goals, but once those are done, it's actually accomplished its part of the mission, and Perseverance needs to then focus on its primary mission, which is why they've got this limited window for Ingenuity operations to be supported. But like Chris mentioned, there's also a chance to extend that or add another window down the road. Ingenuity can sit there and charge its battery and be ready to go whenever Perseverance is ready to act as that communications relay. Obviously, if Perseverance has to drive somewhere, Ingenuity can fly and follow it, so they can stay together and keep exploring together, which is really cool. But that's why they've got that window initially.
Yeah, they can. It's like Perseverance took a pet bird along
Yeah.
with it. Like, that's just gonna keep following it. But it is. I think it is worthwhile to point out that while it does somewhat stymie the sort of roving element to the science that the Perseverance is doing, there are still a lot of things on Perseverance that are being checked out and activated that the team is still going through and doing. And there are some things that don't require it to be mobile, that it can do. And one of those things they just actually, it did while it was waiting for Ingenuity to do its flight. The Moxie experiment successfully extracted carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere and made breathable oxygen. And that's huge. That is huge for future human exploration initiatives. So, Perseverance is still doing things. It's not just sitting there going like, oh, come on, fly again.
Yeah, that was super big news for the Moxie experiment, and that's huge news. If you're a Starship fan, if you're a SpaceX fan, and you want to send people to Mars, that experiment meant a lot because we hadn't done that before, and that will be a huge part of Mars colonization, producing breathable air out of Martian resources. So,
and it's
yeah,
huge for Starship production operations too on Earth, right?
yes,
Because they're going to need to pull a lot of stuff out of the atmosphere to make oxygen and methane in the quantities that they need it. And pulling carbon dioxide out of Earth's atmosphere is going to be a large part of Starship's overall ground infrastructure as well, not just on Mars. So
it's a very productive week on Mars between Perseverance and Ingenuity. Really quick, Bob and Michelle Murray with a new membership. Thank you so much for the support. Appreciate it. And we are going to jump in for the remaining. We got like a half hour left of the show. Let's talk about that shiny rocket down in Boca Chica, Texas, that may or may not go to Mars one day. Probably going to Mars. Well, not this particular. If this particular one goes to Mars, something strange has happened. But,
wait, Thomas, my first question: why is there only a half ship there?
Oh yeah, so we got 1.5 starships down in Boca Chica right now. We've got that weird nose cone test stand thing that we're not actually entirely sure exactly what it is. It looks like some sort of structural test article for the nose cone, so that's what we're going with. But we've also got Starship SN15 out on the suborbital pad A. Michael, it's pad
Correct.
A, right? Okay,
yes.
it is pad A. Okay, thank you.
although props to your Fonzie impression. That was good. Now, John, in case you don't know, Fonzie was the character from a 1970s television show. Sorry.
So Starship
I mix the pad letters up every time.
I kid, John. I kid. Only because we like you.
For the viewers that don't know, I'm actually 10 years old.
More like 9. SN15 is undergoing some test flight, pre-test flight testing. It's gone through some ambient temperature stuff, some proof stuff. Its static fire is still upcoming, I believe, no earlier than Monday, and Michael will correct me if that's wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's still Monday. Which will be the first firing of its 3 Raptor engines, and that'll be that final test to clear the way towards launch, as far as we know. So launch potentially later this coming week. And this will be that first flight of this sort of newly upgraded Starship vehicle, which from the outside, it doesn't look that different. Not a lot of huge visible changes, but we know that the Raptor design has been upgraded to be a little more reliable and address some of the issues they had on some earlier flights. We also, I'm trying to think, what else do we know has changed on SN15? Because I know we get asked this question all the time.
Heat shield.
More heat shield tiles. Right? There are more heat. You can't see them on this view, but on the exact opposite side of this camera view, there's a bunch of heat shield tiles, more than they've attached before. So that's another change. Yeah.
I can't think of any.
Elon has said there's like hundreds of changes that they've implemented, but a lot of them are very, very small things that we would never see just looking at it.
Maybe they added the landing.exe file and the don't explode afterward file.
The remain intact after landing.exe. Yeah. That's another good one. Yeah.
Pointy end up even after landing.
To be fair, there probably have been some software tweaks, so we're not entirely joking there. But I don't know if landing.exe is a new file name. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, aside
Dan
from
in chat said
the Raptor upgrades.
Oh, that's true. There was a Starlink antenna put on the side.
Oh, that's right.
Which is this weird. I don't know if I fully understand what they're even going to do there. Like, Starship in-flight entertainment? I don't know. Like, once you're on
Well,
the way to
there-
Mars, you
Maybe.
can't reach the Starlink satellites
well,
anymore.
there was also one of those things where like when you mounted to the side where I was like, what is this, Kerbal space? Like,
Yeah, just put the antenna anywhere it fits. It still works. It doesn't matter which way it's
yeah,
pointed.
it just ignore gravity, like ignore aerodynamics. No,
Could it be for like telemetry, like better than their
yeah,
current systems?
yeah, it could be for that, for ground testing. I mean, I'm not sure. Or do we know for certain that's like an in-flight thing they plan to do, or
I
will that potentially
believe
come
there
off
was
before they lift off?
FCC. I believe there was
Oh,
FCC
okay.
documentation saying that it's up to like an altitude of 10 kilometers or whatever. So I was
Oh,
like, clearly
okay.
they're gonna try to do it during flight, but I don't know. Like that antenna should not be connecting to ground stations; just be connecting to the satellites, right?
Yes.
So maybe this is a weird way to test. Like, I know at some point they want Starlink connectivity on like airplanes and things like that.
That's what I was just gonna say. Is this a
Maybe it's related
brilliant?
to that.
Because I mean, what, to 10 kilometers? That's just below what aircraft fly at, right? Aircraft are like 11 or 12 kilometers.
Hold on, let me do the metric to kilometers to feet. That so 10 kilometers is a typical cruising altitude. It's just about 33,000 feet.
Oh,
So
okay. So there we go.
it's actually, you know what? So all right. So now that we've identified that, it probably is related to aircraft testing. That would make sense.
Brilliant move.
Although I also don't know. I mean, okay, but couldn't you also just put it on an airplane? Like,
You
No.
could, but you'd have to convince
Physically
an
impossible.
Yeah. You'd have to convince one of the carriers to do it first. This does the convincing for them that there's no risk to.
Possible.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I know Elon's got a private jet. You couldn't have used that as a test bed. I don't know.
Well,
But,
yeah, okay.
If I'm remembering correctly, I think Michael Sheets of CNBC had a report that they did get approval to do it on like small private aircraft.
Hmm.
I may be saying two specifics that aren't true, but I think they do have approval to do it on planes, right?
Maybe.
I mean, there's nothing that would preclude it. No.
Michael says, yeah, they are putting one on Elon's jet. So, okay, if they're doing that, what could be different? Oh, well, all right, I could give you a lot of things that would be different putting it on a Starship, but why would you put it on a Starship? Maybe it's something to do with actually testing Starlink connectivity with Starship systems in some way. I mean, if you're in low Earth orbit,
Well, it could, because in low Earth orbit, you'd still be communicating upward to them. I mean, the Starlinks could provide a in-house version of NASA's tracking and data relay
right?
satellite
Yeah,
network.
exactly. So maybe that's what it is, and maybe it's less about testing can the Starlink satellites connect to something at that altitude because they can test that on a plane, but it might be testing can Starship interface with the Starlink connectivity.
And this is also probably to ensure complete connectivity throughout the entire flight envelope, because if you can put your antennas on the leeward side of the vehicle, the side that's not going to be covered in a heat shield, that is the side that you're trying to radiate heat away from, not actually protect against the plasma that's hugging your skin during reentry, you can get stable connections upward if you have antennas on the leeward side. In fact, what blocked communications a lot during atmospheric reentry with the shuttle was not the plasma enveloping the vehicle. It was when the gigantic tail would block the line of sight upward to the communication antennas. So I bet you 10 to 1 that's also for complete communications throughout the flight envelope.
That's a good shout there. Really quick, a super chat from Jim saying, "What a week! Great coverage as always. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the support there, Jim." I'm going to pull out some questions about Starship 2. Let's see here. Would it be useful to launch Super Heavy on its own to orbit without Starship? Super Heavy, no. So Starship is going to be the way that they handle on-orbit refueling and things like that. They'll have a tanker variant, which is optimized to just carry as much fuel as they can. And that's a big part of the human landing system architecture too. But Super Heavy is going to be solely used to launch starships begin their orbital trajectories, basically. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Joseph says it's actually 2 starships because it's Starship SN15, the nose cone, and Starhopper. So the nose cone plus Starhopper is one complete starship. There you go. Appreciate the message there, Joseph. Let's see. How much production of the SN and BN series will eventually be automated? So we're talking about production cadence there. Do we know how much of it might already be automated and how they might improve that going forward?
That is a really good question. I mean, I could certainly see the benefits to it. When once you have a more solidified or finalized design. I know Elon is saying, like you want to be able to reuse the boosters about every 2 hours. You want to be able to reuse the spaceship or the Starship itself maybe 2 to 3 times a day, depending on how much you can get the ground tracks to align with the landing sites and the launch sites. But how many of them they'll need, how many of them they'll want. I mean, assembly line would certainly cut it down, but you need to get to a finalized design first. And I think we're many, many, many out from that to get to the actual answer to your question. I think we're many, many, many BN series and SN series is away from them being comfortable enough to commit to some kind of an automation line here. But they also might not have to, given how quickly they can build these things. I mean, automation is supposed to cut down on the time it takes you to build these things. And I mean, they're not even going full bore yet, of what they could if they absolutely had to. So it'll be interesting to see how it evolves. Yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out, like their production facility at Boca is like respectively sized, but like they can ramp that up. Like there is a lot of empty land there for when this really gets going within the next decade. Like, yeah, they
Yeah.
could add a lot of production
Well,
capability.
and I think we've already seen part of the bottleneck is like when they had booster number 1 in the high bay being stacked and they had SN15 in the high bay, and then suddenly they're like, well, we don't have any other room in the high bay because we can't send 15 out to the pad because the pads are occupied. I mean, I think once the launch cadence starts picking up, I think that's when we'll see a lot of like, what can they do with what they have now, and then the expansion, like you were saying. I mean, there's so much room that they could expand to out there.
Yeah, and also you have to keep in mind that they'll also likely be bringing up a excuse me, similar production facility here on the East Coast in Florida because they want to have those sort of parallel operations, and they've got a facility that's kind of being expanded at the Kennedy Space Center at Roberts Road. They've also got their Sitco Road facility, which is supporting some aspects of Starship production. So between all of those things, it's not only they could grow their Boca Chica footprint, they could also introduce additional facilities. And again, as they move closer to operational missions where they really want to have a lot of supporting infrastructure for that production, we'll see that grow too. So, and I think that goes hand in hand with automation. Back to the question, as when they get to that final operational design, or at least a final operational design, that doesn't mean they couldn't redesign a Starship to kind of upgrade it down the road. But once they have a sort of frozen design that is operational, we'll see increase in automation and then scaling that production up. Another question here from Rogue asking, could a lunar starship make it to low Earth orbit with only the 3 vacuum raptors? So I'm assuming this is referring to the fact that lunar starship doesn't really have a need for sea level raptors. It's never going to land on Earth, and when it's landing on the moon, it's going to use those final descent thrusters higher up. In fact, I could bring up the render really quick to kind of talk about it. So the question is, why bother having any sea level raptors? You're not really going to use them. There is something to be said during the initial launch. I believe we expect that 3 vacuum raptors might not be enough thrust to make an orbital flight profile. So they'll use the sea level raptors to get just a little bit of extra thrust, even though they're not operating at full efficiency that high up. I believe the idea is that they will still use those engines during at least the initial part of that stage 2 burn, if you want to call it that, to reach orbit. However, if you don't need a sea level optimized engine at all, would it actually make more sense to have the thrust puck on the lunar variant have 4 vacuum raptors, like replace the center 3 sea level engines with 1 vacuum raptor, and would that be enough thrust and actually be more efficient? I wonder if that's a possibility.
I mean, I think anything's a real possibility
That's
with
true.
with the lunar variant of the ship. Yeah, because if it doesn't have to worry about atmospheric reentry, it does call that into question. But I would say you're right. Every single official video we have seen from SpaceX shows all 6 igniting after staging, which
Mhm.
to me indicates you need all 6 to reach orbit, because you need to put a full propellant load into Starship, right? In order for it to initially reach low Earth orbit, you could probably wiggle that a little bit around if you wanted to pack a little bit more extra mass into the depending on what you wanted to do. But the crux of the design is based around that. So yeah, I don't know how they would opt to change, or if they would want to change it. You know, in that regard, we'll have to see.
And that's sort of a related question, Sebastian asking why, how about 6 vacuum engines? The vacuum engines are much bigger than the sea level engines. And so I don't think you could fit 6 vacuum engines. In fact, I believe SpaceX put out a photo of a vacuum Raptor engine next to a sea level engine. I'm going to pull it up really quick. I think if I go, yeah, this one.
Yeah, it's basically like all the extra space you see in the engine compartment during a Starship hop is like reserved for 3 of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see the vacuum engine. You can see if you look at sort of the power head on the top, you can see how they're pretty much at angle. You see the turbine structure that's here on the right. You see the same sort of general like plumbing format, but then you get down here and just the engine bell is so much bigger, and that's basically how you vacuum optimize an engine is you change the nozzle design.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that's why you can't. I don't think we'll expect 6 vacuum engines. If they're gonna swap out sea level engines, it might be like the center cluster of 3 for 1 more vacuum engine. But it might make more sense just to have all 6 engines like you normally do, even on the
But
Moon variant.
yeah, here's the reason that this would become highly problematic during second stage flight, and here's why those here's why those sea level Raptor engines light. They're the only ones that gimbal. You still need gimbal control on second stage flight. So if you take away the 3 engines that have been designed for gimbaling, you lose your ability to get to orbit. Plain and simple. You also, the high thrust, even on the minimal setting of Raptors for orbital maneuvers and orbit change maneuvers and everything, you still need to be able to gimbal. The vacuums don't gimbal where they are
Right.
mounted right now. You'd have to significantly change the gimbaling system inside of the vehicle to replace 3 with 1. So this might be a moment where, yes, it's less efficient to have a sea level Raptor for orbital maneuvering, but you might still need to ignite it
Mhm.
to get the gimbal profiles that you need. Um, but that's also something where your hot gas thrusters could help in some regard. But it's the gimbaling during ascent that I find very difficult to get rid of,
Yeah,
because you need it.
absolutely. And then Bosky asking, shouldn't the sea level Raptors only be used on boosters? Could there be a third mid-altitude variant introduced once booster flights become common? You have to keep in mind that if a Starship is going to land on Earth, you need the sea level Raptor for landing, which is kind of the main purpose of and why that engine has the gimbal authority, because that's your landing engine. But as far as like we're mentioning earlier, there's gimbal authority that even on something like a lunar starship, which is never going to land on Earth, still needs. There are other reasons why you would still want sea level Raptors, even on things that are not boosters. So yeah, there's a couple reasons to keep them around.
Yeah.
I'm bringing back the panel here for a second. Other questions coming in. If they plan on catching the booster, how will it line up the GSE connections when placing it back on the launch pad? So Elon actually recently reiterating that their plan to recover both Starships and Super Heavy boosters is not with landing legs, but with some sort of ground infrastructure, some sort of catch tower, which I don't know. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
thing
we'll
that might
see.
happen. We'll see. It'll
I'm
be interesting to see what the design looks like. I'm trying not to like jump to like, oh, that's impossible, because if you ever said that about a SpaceX program, we've usually been proven wrong. But it sounds so crazy. So I'm interested to see how it's going to look. I
Well,
would
yeah,
imagine
because
Yeah.
though, yeah,
not the least of which being, if you design it so it has to land with a tower to catch it, how does it
How
land
do you
on
go to Mars?
Mars?
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I
I
think
mean,
I
it makes sense for the
understand.
booster. I get it for the
Yeah,
booster because you want to save the weight and the mass of the legs. I don't get it for the Starship one. Like I'm having a really hard time with that one from a conceptual and operational standpoint.
It just feels like a lack of commonality in the design. If you're going to have starships for point to
Right.
point, but also starships that are going to Mars, like why not just let them all have some sort of leg?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the mass savings of removing the legs on the ship are really like consequential, because I know like with second stages that mass is more one to one, right? With what you
Right.
can get to
But
orbit. So
then
I don't
remember
know.
how overbuilt Starship is to begin with.
Exactly. So it's confusing to me, but I guess we'll
yeah.
see.
Yeah. I mean, I also just have the questions like the booster one makes more sense to me, even from like the physics standpoint, because you've got the grid fin attach points that cradle arms could potentially, that the booster could potentially lower itself on the grid fins onto those. Like there are ways that I'm envisioning how that works with catching it, right? That fundamentally work because you have 4 massive grid fins that deploy from the top of it. How do you avoid the articulating aero surface flaps on board Starship? And it doesn't have grid fins, so what do you catch it with? Like, what does the tower literally reach out and grab? Also, considering half of your vehicle is delicate thermal protection system tiles.
Hmm.
And think about
I'm
point
just
to point.
yeah,
Anywhere you want to go, you're going to have a tower versus just a large, thick slab of whatever, right?
right, right.
I don't know,
This is
just
where I'm
another
having.
point.
Yeah, no, I'm. mm,
It's interesting to think about, and I think I keep going back to even talking about the booster. When the interplanetary transport system was first proposed, the what eventually became Super Heavy was supposed to land on the launch mount, not with a tower,
Oh
but
yeah.
with the connections at the bottom would basically grab it at the bottom. Don't know what happened to that. I understand this.
Oh, I do. I have a good idea what happened with that. I don't know for sure, but I do.
Please want to share with the class.
It's the question Robert. It's the question Robert's asking. If the
Yeah,
booster flies itself back to the launch mount, how does it perform a pinpoint accurate alignment with its tail surface mass that have to be reconnected? I get autonomous connection and reconnection of GSE equipment. I get that, but that is predicated on there being an alignment factor that's already within limits, and that's why landing on the launch mount to me was always like, I don't know how you do that from a refueling perspective.
I mean, couldn't
This
you
is
just
where
shouldn't the ground equipment be put on a structure that can then rotate around? Like it's a cylindrical booster.
you could, I mean, it adds complexity to your
It
system,
does.
but you could do
Although,
that. Yeah.
in the words of Peter Beck, you want your ground support equipment to be very complicated so that your vehicle is as simple as possible. So adding complexity on the ground equipment side is not. Obviously, again, you want things to be as simple as possible, but not simpler.
Right.
But
But also it's not like connecting, like if it was if it was an ambient temperature ground support equipment port,
hmm,
I could see how designing something on the ground that moves and shifts, and you can go no,
that's
zero
true.
0.3 degrees to the right,
Yeah,
works. Once you get into super chilled cryogenic, that it's not impossible, but it gets harder,
that's true. That's a good
right?
point.
But this is where catching the booster with arms on the tower, where the arms can then make that slight little adjustment to align yourself with the GSE on the base, makes a lot more sense to me. And retires a lot of the risk of mobile GSE, or however they were planning to do that.
Just
When
get
it
one
was
of
just going to
those
come
like
back to the mount.
Tesla chargers that they never actually shift, but like the robot arm that like
Hmm.
finds the GSE connection.
Like it comes down, it's like,
Yep.
yeah.
Really quick, a super chat here from Anna saying, "Shout out to Mary Boca Chica Gal for the updates and photos. Thanks, Mary. We love your work. Absolutely, all the video. Whenever we're rolling all this Boca Chica footage, that's from Mary Boca Chica Gal for NSF. So a big thank you to Mary as always, and thank you for the support there, Anna. We all appreciate it." And Wes Irvin with the $42 super chat. The answer to the life, the universe, and everything. Appreciate the support there. Just a general space comment saying it's cool that they use the red and green markers in homage to nautical light navigation. Yeah, you can see that on Crew Dragon when it's docking. I'm assuming that's where that comic comes from. Just like on an aircraft or on a boat, the red and green on the left and right, or port and starboard, I guess is the correct term. That is very cool. And thank you so much for the super chat. Appreciate it. I'm trying to think. Oh, wait. You know what? I've been waiting. I rolled this video because see, all right, here's the problem. There's 20 minutes of footage from one day in Boca Chica, which is why it hasn't showed up yet. Thanks, Mary, again. I was trying to find in this video somewhere is a cool clip that I just want to bring up really quick. And this one, I think. Zeus and Apollo out walking around at the suborbital launch site in Boca Chica. They're two Boston Dynamics dogs. Check this out.
Yes.
This is what a 21st century spaceport looks like. There are robot dogs walking around.
Hey, automated
That's
dogs
awesome.
for an automated starship.
A question here, Crazy Dave saying perhaps no legs for the tanker and cargo versions. Yeah, so you can design out the legs on versions that are not going to the moon and Mars. Because as long as they're landing on Earth, because then you can put that ground equipment on Earth, but you lose some commonality with the other variants. I know. I guess it depends on how much mass savings they're really getting by removing those legs. I feel like it can't be. Well, all right. Here's another thing. When you're landing on the moon or Mars, you have a lot less gravity, and thus the legs actually have to support less weight and can be lighter. When you're landing on Earth, the weight is greater, and thus your legs have to be stronger. So I wonder if the ground equipment, whether it's a catch tower or whatever, support you being used to land these vehicles is less a result of we want to remove legs entirely, but more a result of in order to make legs that work as well as we want them to on Earth, they would need to be even heavier than the ones that are going to the moon and Mars. Obviously, these test vehicles can eat that because they're not putting payload on it. They're not going all the way to orbit right away. Maybe that's a factor. What do you think, Chris?
Could be. I think. I mean, it could be. I mean, don't get me wrong. It could be because it's always a mass savings game, right? And the more you can save, the more you can take. The more propellant margin you could be left with. I think in part it's a way to help just simplify the design overall, right? And what's a good way to simplify a design? Making a landing system that isn't reliant on legs deploying.
I guess. I mean, there was also. We'll see. I guess what I would really like to see is what the tower looks like and let them actually build one. I know they're working on the orbital launch tower at the launch site in Boca Chica.
True.
I don't know if that tower will initially have whatever catch mechanism they're looking at, or if that's something they'll add later after like the initial flights. But that'll be something interesting to see and kind of give us an idea how it might look. And then that first orbital launch attempt, let's see if they actually the first time they attempt that recovery, will be a big thing. It
Yeah,
could
and
be, the for Falcon 9.
Nuclear ground support.
Yeah, right. The first time they tried to recover a Falcon 9 first stage was with parachutes, and that didn't work, and they moved to propulsive landing. When they first started to attempt to recover payload fairings, that was with a parachute catching it in a boat, and evolved to just splashing them down in the ocean and recovering them that way. So they can evolve their recovery plans and try a couple different, approaches to that. So maybe that's something that we'll keep it on to. Just because it's the one they attempt first doesn't mean that is the end result that they'll look at. But it'll be definitely very interesting to keep a very close eye on and see how that part of the system develops. I think we've actually gone through most of the questions that have come through.
the toy truck on the back of the actual truck.
Oh yeah,
really
apparently this is
was funny.
a trucker thing where they'll put a toy truck on the flatbed. So that's nice and cool. But anyway, that I believe is actually going to do it for this week's episode of NASA Spaceflight Live. We talked about Crew-2, we talked about Ingenuity, and we talked about Starship. And I want to give a big thank you to John Kraus for coming out and joining us. John, thanks for joining us for the episode today.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And Chris G, thank you as always for being on. I actually want you to. Well, this game review is perfect because we had one last question in the queue asking where can I get that Endeavor shirt that Chris G is wearing, And
Yes.
you should check that out. NASASpaceflight.com/shop for the Endeavor T-shirt. There, it's very cool, and hopefully they keep flying Endeavor, so the shirt keeps being relevant. We want it to keep reflying that capsule.
Well, or
Uh,
not. We'll just have to add the next one that gets named Endeavor.
Oh yeah, well, the first Starship named Endeavor. We'll make a new version of the
Yes.
shirt. Also, if you want to check out some prints and other things and digital downloads of things from Mr. John Kraus here, you can check out johnkrausphotos.com and you can check out some of his amazing photography work. Want to have him on the show without sharing that. So if you want to support him as well, please do. He does amazing stuff. Thank you, everyone, for all of your support during the stream with the super chats and the memberships. We do want to always give a big thank you to our top tier members, our launch directors and flight engineers. I'm going to say it like I do every time. The font on this page keeps getting smaller because you guys keep bringing the support, and we really do appreciate everyone helping us to do what we do with the NSF Live and the launch commentaries and the Starship coverage, all of that. We greatly appreciate it. But that is going to do it for today's episode. My name is Thomas Burghardt, and for NASA Spaceflight team and John Kraus, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.
Propulsion continues to be normal.
RCP chamber pressure looks good. Following up. Roger, roll, Atlantic.
Water towers fly!
Flight downside at speed off. Speed off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.